Several times in recent decades, Ebola has appeared from the forests in Africa, started an outbreak of disease in humans and then vanished. Researchers believe that between outbreaks, the virus must be in a wild animal host without causing much harm. Now, till now, the host has remained elusive, but there is hope.
Earlier this year, scientists discovered the Marburg virus, the deadly cousin of Ebola, isolated in fruit bats in Sierra Leone, marking the first time it has been found in West Africa. The testing was an American-led effort known as PREDICT, and they're hoping they can now do the same for Ebola. Dr. Brian Bird is leading PREDICT's Ebola host project, and he explained to me how the hunt for Ebola's host was progressing and whether a vaccine against it will soon be a cure.
My whole career has been looking for the origins of these hemorrhagic fever viruses and how we could figure out where they come from to get better risk messaging to tell people specifically, what things to avoid in the forests. But I work for a large global program called PREDICT, and this is funded by the U.S. Agency for International Development. And this is a program working in 30 countries, many of them in Africa and in Asia, where we're doing a sort of a comprehensive look for what new and emerging viruses might be coming out of wildlife or other domesticated animals that could be threats to human health. And then in Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Liberia specifically, there's a part of the project called the Ebola Host Project, where we're looking for where do Ebola viruses come from, what animals are the reservoirs, what's the source, and in part of that work, we found Marburg virus, the cousin of Ebola, in Egyptian Rosetus aegyptiacus fruit bats.
This virus is absolutely terrifying and poses actually a massive threat to global health.
I would agree with that. I mean, in my experiences working in Ebola and Marburg outbreaks in West Africa and Sierra Leone specifically during the recent large outbreak, viruses like Ebola or Marburg certainly pose a real threat to our way of life.
But aren't your team taking massive personal risk by going into the heart of the jungle and trying to collect this scientific data?
Well, there is some risk involved in any kind of scientific work. Of course, our teams take extreme precautions to work with the wildlife in a safe way.
It's like collecting saliva from monkeys. How do you do that safely?
Well, you do it very carefully after lots of training. We wear protective equipment that looks very similar or is virtually identical to what you might see being used in some of the hemorrhagic fever treatment wards. So people are protected from any possible route of exposure, through their eyes or oral mucosa. We take a lot of time and effort goes into training these teams to do this work safely. I personally take a deep sense of ownership and care in making sure my teams are operating safely because I've seen firsthand what these viruses can do in people, and it can be devastating.
Because your teams worked in Sierra Leone during the recent Ebola outbreak there. I mean, what did they find, and how can they use that information to help humanity?
Well, there's two sides to that. My work, the former work during the large outbreak, I was part of the US CDC, leading some of the laboratory field diagnostics where we would take specimens from potential suspect patients, human patients, and test them rapidly. Certainly laboratory testing is a critical part of any Ebola response because you need to be able to rapidly identify who has been infected by the virus and who hasn't. So then you can move people that are infected into appropriate treatment hospitals to receive medical care. And those that aren't, they just happen to be sick, but they don't have Ebola. You certainly don't want to put them into those kind of environments. So now my focus is much more on the animal origins of these viruses and trying to determine what are the exact animal hosts and then what kind of specific messages can we create to inform the public, let them know of the risks so that then they can make their own personal public health decisions to avoid those animals.
You mentioned that your team discovered this year that the Marburg virus, the deadly cousin of Ebola that was found in fruit bats in Sierra Leone. How optimistic are you that the research you've done will ultimately find the host for Ebola?
Well, I'm very hopeful that it will. One of the strengths of the PREDICT approach that we're using in Africa and across Asia is really intensive animal sampling. We know that Ebola and Marburg, for that matter, spill over only rather infrequently, right? We've known of Ebola for about 42 years, Marburg for a little over 50. And when the virus spills over from the animal host into that first human, it's a relatively rare event. And if you want to find the reservoir, the host of a virus that spills over only infrequently, we need to be sampling a lot of animals and a lot of targeted taxa, different types of animals, so that you can cast as big a net as you can to catch this rather elusive fish.
Even if the host is not found soon, how close are we to getting a vaccine to counter Ebola? Is a cure to stop people getting infected going to happen in the foreseeable future?
Well, I think that's probably the most exciting thing recently since the early stages of the West African outbreak 2014 to 2016 is the development and use of human vaccines. Right now, as you probably well know, there's a large Ebola outbreak in northeastern DRC and North Kivu. And there, a vaccine is being utilized rather heavily to ring vaccinate around infected patients so that their contacts would then be protected. So we already have vaccines on the shelf that are in use for Ebola virus. And that vaccine does appear to be quite effective in controlling the outbreak. The first studies were done towards the end of the West African outbreak in humans, the first large-scale human trials. And now it's being used widely in that outbreak in eastern DRC. So we're very close to having potential vaccines that really could be used prophylactically. Hopefully, at some point, we'll get to a stage where we could then vaccinate people that live in these high-risk areas for Ebola like we would for measles or polio. Greatest hope for 2019 would be that the Ebola outbreak in eastern DRC comes to a peaceful close. We're able to stop that virus from spreading further in East Africa, and that we all have a closer tie to world peace and happiness.
He really is one of the top people in the world in the fight against Ebola. That's Dr. Brian Bird from the PREDICT Project.